Welcome back to Battle for Normandy for the second round of Matrix Games Combat Mission Grand Tournament. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the Barkmann's Corner tournament scenario. Terrain analysis, an overview of the objective and forces for both sides, and a couple of options for both sides to maximise their chances. As in the last one, obviously, spoilers ahead. The scenario revolves around the story of the German tank commander Ernst Barkmann, single-handedly inflicting heavy losses on an advancing column of US Army tanks with his Panther on the 27th of July 1944. Whether or not this actually happened is up for debate, but that's not really relevant to the game. The key takeaway here is that this is a German defence against an Allied attack with a focus on tanks. This might strike you as interesting looking at the map for the first time. This isn't quite tank country. Although there are some fairly big fields, ranges are still short and freedom of movement is restricted by Barkmann. Looking north, with the Germans on the left and the Americans on the right, the Barkmann splits the map into three corridors. Let's call them A, B and C. At the top we have Corridor A, a long, thin field running along the map edge, and beneath that a big, irregular wheat field. This has Barkmann at the American end, but the German end is marked by a reverse slope leading down to a low wall and the building cluster of Favre's community. In the centre, we have Corridor B, bounded by the irregular edge of the wheat field to the top and the main road to the bottom. There's an important bottleneck here about halfway across, a small farm sat in the narrowest part of the field. Again, the corridor slopes down on the German side to create a reverse slope. Finally, Corridor C at the bottom is a narrow space between the road and the map edge. This is much more broken by Barkmann than the other corridors, but there is a stretch of thick woods and a farm alongside the road, both of which are flanked along the bottom edge by a long ploughed field. Again, the whole map slopes down towards the German edge. So we have some salient features. Three broad avenues of advance for the Americans, all of which have a reverse slope defended by the Germans at the far end. Into this we can throw the objectives, which are conveniently the same for both sides. There are two ground objectives: Barkmann's Corner, worth 800 points, and Favre's community, worth 400. These are occupy objectives, so to get the points you need to have at least one unit sat in the marked area at the end of the game. If there are any enemy units in there too, then it's contested and no one gets the points. That's probably pretty unlikely in this case because both of these objectives are really small. That in turn changes the emphasis. You don't have a huge area to clear out. Instead, you have to secure the surrounding area to the point that it's safe to sit in the objective. Along with the ground objectives, we have two casualty-based objectives for each side. Inflicting more than 70% casualties on the enemy will net you 400 points, and keeping your own casualties under 30% will get you another 400. That puts 2,000 victory points on the table overall. 40% of those points are locked up in ownership of Barkmann's Corner, so that's going to be the decisive objective. Sitting on it at the start are the Germans, who have a very simple force setup. We have Barkmann's Panther, backed up by a Grenadier company. Barkmann's Panther is an early model Panther G, so it doesn't have the chin mantlet, but it is very well protected to the front. The side and rear are much more vulnerable, but defending on a narrow map gives you a good chance of minimising the risk of getting flanked. In terms of firepower and soft factors, that long 75mm gun will punch holes in Shermans all day long, and Barkmann and his crew are elite and fanatical with the best possible leadership, so they're as good as you can get in combat mission. And to some extent they need to be. Barkmann's Panther is really the critical element of the defence. If that's neutralised, things are going to get a lot harder for the German player. They're not exactly out of the fight though. The company has 3 platoons, each of which includes 2 Panzerschreck teams, and there is another one attached to the company HQ, making a total of 7. These are shorter ranged and much more vulnerable than the Panther, but a Panzerschreck that connects has a good chance of knocking out Allied tanks. 2 men with a big tube are also a lot easier to hide than a 45-ton Panther. The rest of the infantry is better equipped to deal with American troops than tanks. 3 machine guns per platoon, plus 2 tripod-mounted heavy machine guns, but the squads generally do have a couple of very short-ranged Panzerfausts and a couple have grenade launchers. These might give the American player a nasty shock if you're lucky, but I wouldn't count on them to get the job done. Everything on the German side starts off on map, with a pretty generous if shallow deployment zone. The Americans also have a pretty simple force, though it's a mirror image of the Germans. Instead of having an infantry company backed up by a tank, the US force here is a Sherman tank company backed up by a platoon of infantry in half-tracks. Given the terrain, this is probably the more challenging combined arms force composition, an issue that is exacerbated by the Americans arriving in batches. Starting out and immediately deployable around the road on the east map edge, we have 2 tanks from the company HQ, the company commander himself in a Sherman 76, and another tank equipped with the 75 but also fitted with a Rhino barrage busting attachment. This allows the tank to carve gaps in the usually impassable barrage, so it's a really important asset. Also on the map to begin with is the company's 3rd platoon, with 3 Sherman 76s and 2 Sherman 75s. Following on at the 5-minute mark is the 2nd platoon, with 1 76 and 4 75s. At 10 minutes, an armoured infantry platoon turns up. This consists of a HQ element and 3 rifle squads, plus 2 medium machine guns and a 60mm mortar team, all mounted in half-tracks. The platoon HQ rides in an M3A1, armed with a pintle-mounted 50-caliber machine gun. The other half-tracks are M3s with passenger-operated M1919s. 2 important notes about this armoured infantry platoon is that the rifle squads are predominantly armed with Garand. There might be a BAR or 2 in there, but even the squad leaders have rifles, and that each half-track also carries a bazooka with 4 rockets in its inventory. That makes for 5 in total, so make sure you get your infantry to acquire them before they disembark. Finally, at the 15-minute mark, the remaining HQ tank will arrive, armed with a 75, along with 1st Platoon, which is exclusively equipped with 75s. The Shermans overall are a mix of M4A1s and M4A3s. The M4A3s are a little bit better armoured, but probably not in a way that's going to matter against the Panther's 75 at these kinds of distances. The main difference lies in the armament, whether the Sherman mounts a 75 or 76mm gun. Broadly speaking, the 76 is more effective against tanks and the 75 is more effective against infantry. They will, however, both struggle against the front of a Panther and easily penetrate the side, so the more important distinction may well be that the 75s not only have a more effective high explosive round, but carry more ammunition. So with forces, terrain and objectives laid out, 30 minutes on the clock, how can we approach this? Well, let's start off with the defence because it's a little bit easier to conceptualise. The simplest option would be to fight a relatively static defence from the German deployment zone. 1 infantry platoon defending each corridor, and Barkmann moving to put fire on American pushers. This has the advantage of fighting on a reverse slope. The change in elevation blocks line of sight for both sides until the attacker comes over the crest. This translates into American Shermans popping up at close range, within the effective envelope of the Panzerschreck, and if you're lucky, even the Panzerfausts, depending on how you deploy. This is obviously really risky for the Shermans. It's much better for them to sit outside 200 meters, that's the maximum range of the Panzerschreck, and bombard German positions with impunity. That way, they only have to worry about Barkmann, and he can't cover everything at once. Denying them that option and forcing them into a close fight against anti-tank infantry teams they can't observe before entering the kill zone, that's setting up a bad day for the US player. As a bonus, keeping some scouts out in front as a screen is going to allow you to see where the Americans are coming and shuffle your defense around in the safety of the reverse slope so that you're in the right place at the right time to maximize damage. The problem with this plan is that it gives up a lot of ground. There's not a lot of depth to the defense. If something goes wrong, and you should always assume that something's going to go wrong, then it's very difficult to claw anything back. So it's a very all or nothing plan. If the American player gets lucky or does something that's hard to deal with, then you don't have a lot of room to maneuver. So a good option for the Germans here is to push forward and gain some ground. Not only do we establish some depth, but it allows us to dominate bottlenecks in the corridors. Occupying the bocage on the edge of the wheat field, the farm in the middle of Corridor B, and the woods in Corridor C creates a really nasty obstacle for the American player. Obviously, Corridor B becomes a nightmare to push through with an armor-only force, and that's what the American player has for the first 10 minutes of the game. But those positions also allow the German player to put some fire down on the wheat field to the left and into Corridor C on the right. Stacking these points up with Panzerschrecks and Panzerfaust equipped AT teams from the rifle squads is a solid move, doubly so if you're able to stay hidden and pull off ambushes. And of course Barkmann can contribute as well, moving to firing positions behind this line in order to exploit keyholes into the corridors. The ideal state is that the American player's first probes are destroyed or intimidated into holding back until his armoured infantry arrive. That buys you 10 minutes by default, a third of the game, and it's going to take more time for the American player to force you out of those initial positions, and then he has to fight down that reverse slope from the first plan. That's a pretty tough prospect. It's even tougher when you're on the clock and taking casualties all the time. Swapping over, how can the American player attack then? This is a lot more difficult, mostly due to that force composition. The simplest way to attack is to pick a corridor and overwhelm it. One tank aphorism from World War II is, the more you use, the fewer you lose. That's not strictly true, but pushing one avenue of attack with 10 or more Shermans is going to mean more spotting potential, more tanks to delegate to area firing suspicious positions, and more tanks to absorb losses. You don't have to see the enemy to ruin their day, and Sherman 75s carry a lot of very effective high explosive ammunition. If we wanted to hit the bottlenecks in Corridor B, for example, we could roll up, stay out of Panzerschreck range, and blast all the buildings, all the hedgerows and the wood until we're happy that any anti-tank teams in there are sufficiently mangled. From there, it's an exercise in sending a volunteer forward to see if it's actually clear, and standing by to punish any enemy troops that are revealed. This is naturally going to be fairly slow and a little inefficient. It's a slow, indiscriminate grinder, but that doesn't mean it won't work, and it takes advantage of the two American strengths here: firepower and range. Things obviously get a little bit more questionable coming to that reverse slope or entering dense terrain, and Barkmann is probably going to be a problem if the German player isn't helpful enough to expose him to massed anti-tank fire. But the broad principle is solid. Grind forward, smashing everything in the way, and keep applying overwhelming force until the enemy is destroyed and you can occupy the objectives. A slightly more subtle method of attack is the classic fix and flank. Pick a corridor and attack it in enough strength to force the German player to react, then hit another corridor. So, for example, we could send 2 platoons of Shermans to grind down Corridor B and attack that bottleneck, then once the armoured infantry platoon and the final tank platoon arrive, send them down Corridor A or C, overwhelm the defenders there, and then hook in to attack the B defence from the side of the rear, collapsing it. In the German defence, everything except Barkmann is on foot. The entire American force is mobile, and it's not a huge map. Granted, there are some restrictions in the terrain and potential difficulties from hidden enemy units, but Shermans and half-tracks have the speed to get where you want very quickly. Add in the Rhino Sherman, and they can go through bocage as well, creating new routes. This has the potential to create a dilemma for the defender. They're already dealing with one threat, the fixing attack. When another one pops up, they have to make a choice to ignore it, which could be fatal, or send troops to deal with it, which would weaken the area under the fixing attack and might also be fatal. It's always good to force your opponent to make hard decisions. The tricky part will be acting fast enough on the flanking attack to make a difference. There's only 15 minutes left by the time the entire US force is on the field, and that's not a long time to start, win and exploit a new avenue of attack, if the German player can throw resistance in the way. Corridor C is the shortest route to somewhere useful, bringing you right onto the flank of Barkmann's corner, but it's also the one that's the most reliant on the armoured infantry, who could get chewed up going toe-to-toe with all those German MGs. Corridor A is potentially quicker and safer, allowing easier fire support from the Shermans, but the prize is the lesser objective of Favre's community. Although you can still get flanking fire onto the German defence at Corridor B, Barkmann's corner itself and those decisive 800 points are a fair way away, and it could be tough to get there under fire. Corridor B is also a candidate in itself. It's probably the toughest on all fronts, with the combination of bottleneck and reverse slope making it a good defensive position, but drawing the German defence off to both flanks might make them vulnerable to a punch straight up the middle. Looming over all of this is the keystone of the battle for the American player. How do you neutralise Barkmann? With the Panther, the Germans have mobile protected firepower. They can shift it around to deal with any avenue of attack. Without the Panther, the German defence becomes a lot more static, predictable and solvable through the application of overwhelming firepower. The German player is probably going to do their best at picking their engagements so that they're always presenting that thick frontal armour. The front slope is pretty much impenetrable, and while the turret face has some weaknesses, it's not exactly reliably vulnerable. However, degrading fire is always an option. Non-penetrating hits are still going to damage the optics, and in a stand-up slugging match, the Panther is going to get less and less effective as time goes on. And that's without factoring in the potential of lucky hits. A round into the muzzle brake takes Barkmann out of the fight. A round into the tracks pins him in place. A burst of machine gun fire can take his head off if he's opened up. The crew's high soft factors can actually work to your advantage here. They're less likely to pull back under fire and more likely to sit there absorbing hits, losing spotting potential and rolling the dice on critical subsystem damage every time. That's just from the front though. To reliably tackle the Panther, you really want to be shooting into that side armour, whether that's by the classic fix and flank or by spreading your Shermans out to maximise the angles. The threat of getting flanking shots is also useful. It's a ballsy German player who keeps Barkmann in a position where he might get hit in the side, so exerting threat, even if you can't make the shot, can force him to pull back, reorient, whatever, which will open another part of the field, or if you're lucky, expose him to something else. All of this, of course, relies on working out where the Panther is, which could be tough. Unless the German player is helpful enough to leave him out in the open where you can see and engage him, you're probably going to find where he is the hard way. Overall, this is another battle that could go either way. I think the Americans have the harder job. It's usually more difficult to attack anyway, and the terrain isn't the best for their tank to infantry ratio. But the Germans are relying heavily on Barkmann. He might be good, but one mistake or a bit of bad luck, and he could be out of the fight. There's a good number of people signed up taking part in the tournament. You can see how it's going on the Matrix Games website. I'll leave a link to that down below. If you're participating, hopefully you found this helpful. If you're just along for the ride, I hope you found it interesting, and I'll catch you all in the next video.